beating me to the waiting room, Ali. You keep beating me to it, I think.
I thought you said I was sending you that, and I didn't know how that happened.
All right, we'll still give it a couple more minutes. There seems to be a steady stream of people arriving, which is great. Popular topic. Three minutes past seems like a good time to start, so I'm randomly choosing that. Gives us a minute. All right, you can keep letting people in, Ali, and we'll make a start. So, tēnā koutou katoa, welcome everybody to this session on this great piece of research that has come out recently on organics in New Zealand, and the kinds of things we are already doing and need to see happening as well. So my name's Daughter, I'm from the Zero Waste Network, and it's my job to kind of open the session and welcome you all today. I'll start with a karakia, and in honour of the fact that I have just put on my beanie and my scarf and I have a hot water bottle and it is matariki, I'm going to start with a particular karakia about the winds and the frost. So he karakia tēnei, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā tara ki tai, ehi ake ana te atakura ki teo, he huka, he hauhanga, haumea hui e, tai ki e. So thank you very much all for coming. I'm going to pass over to Liam Prince, who's going to do some introductions, and I'll be back at the end. Have a good session.
Kia ora, thanks so much, Daughter, and Ali and everyone Zero Waste Network for hosting us. So I'm just going to share the screen, and hopefully you can see that. Cool. So yeah, and thanks everyone for coming to the session today. Awesome to see quite a good turnout and a bunch of familiar and unfamiliar names and faces. So yeah, so this presentation is really summarizing a report that was worked on by myself and Hannah here from the Zero Waste Network research team, and really trying to flesh out the interests of the Zero Waste Network and particularly small and medium scale composting and organics diversion initiatives. But we also got to team up with the wonderful Graydon Dipros from Manaaki Whenua, who will help present some of the stuff today, and we're all here to answer questions, but I'll just hand over to Graydon to introduce himself.
Kia ora koutou. Yeah, I'm Graydon Dipros. I'm an environmental social science researcher at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, which is one of the Crown Research Institutes. And just a shout out to some colleagues of mine who helped on this work as well, Pam Booth and Emily Levinson. So yeah. Oh, and also our time was funded, or my time rather, was funded by the Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities National Science Challenge, which they were, yeah, so it's part of a piece of work looking at urban wellbeing. Hence, it might make a bit more sense once we get into the rest of the presentation about why those connections are there. So yeah, thanks, Liam.
Cool. Thanks, Graydon. So going to run through the presentation, and it's very much just a summary of this report that we put together. It was released last month. It's called Scaling Up, Scaling Out and Branching Out, Understanding and Procuring Diverse Organic Materials Management Models in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We'll kind of go through the key points, but please feel free to, throw questions at us as we go, and we'll hopefully won't spend more than half an hour going through this presentation and leave the rest of the time for a discussion, for questions from you. And we also have some questions for you on sort of your reflections on this work as well. So yeah, start with a bit of a background as to what led us to doing this report. The first part of that was a survey that we conducted on operators, which we'll talk about and summarize. Then touch on some common terminology that we analysed, which helped us to develop a taxonomy for the report, which is just another way of saying a framework for categorising different operators based on our analysis of the survey results. And we'll go into more detail around how that taxonomy works, and then conclude with some thoughts on investment and procurement. So background, how did we get here? Really, it's important to note that diverting organics from landfill is at the front and centre of waste minimisation in Aotearoa at the moment, and it's primarily being driven by emissions reduction goals. And the government has put a decent amount of money up for this through the Waste Minimisation Fund and also the Climate Emergency Response Fund to build organics diversion infrastructure. And these goals are also being supported by the proposals that from Transforming Recycling, which have now been adopted, and particularly the requirement for all councils to collect food scraps from households and potentially businesses as well by 2030 at the latest, and some of them earlier if they are within the proximity of a large processing facility. But what is clear to us from these policies and proposals is that large-scale facilities that serve a large geographic area are favoured as the most viable option for processing large quantities of organics. And again, it's evident in the Waste Minimisation Fund priorities and also these requirements for councils who are within 150 kilometres of an existing large processing facility to have collections in place earlier by 2027. But these policies and proposals don't provide any guidance for how cities or districts might be able to manage organics using a wider variety of processing systems. And it just seems to reflect a general lack of understanding within the waste sector more broadly about all the diversity of organics collectors and processors that exist across Aotearoa. So all of these factors really led to us doing research and a survey to help better understand this diversity and also the value of organics diversion initiatives. The research was also informed by some meetings that MFE held between themselves and composters around this time last year. And some of you on this call may have attended some of those meetings as well. Following that, an MFE staff member suggested that there's really a need for more data to better understand the existing composting operators and enterprises to help them with policy and investment. And given the government's current interest in organic waste, we felt it was important to take advantage of this moment and highlight the impacts and outcomes of organics diversion that goes beyond just emissions reduction. So that was an important focus for us. So the survey was the first thing that we did following all this. It's when we, the Zero Waste Network research team, teamed up with Manaki Whenua in Graydon, and we put together the survey, which went out in October and November last year. And again, many of you may have participated in the survey. At the time, we made the call to focus on composting activities. Again, that was in response to some of the conversations with MFE and the information they were wanting about community composting, or what they call community composting. But we did want to broaden it out to composting operators, but because we use that term composting, it very likely limited the range of responses that we got to those who do composting, but also we got some worm farming enterprises who responded too. We advertised the survey quite widely, and we ended up with 41 responses, not quite as many as we had hoped for, but still quite a good number, which represented 41 enterprises and initiatives across 59 sites and 14 regions throughout the country. And just a snapshot of what that represented. 30 of those participants were collecting over 200,000 tonnes a year, and in addition to nearly 70,000 litres for those who measured it that way, and produced lots of compost outputs as well. So, pretty substantial numbers of organics, people processing organics were represented in the survey. Yeah, I'll hand over to Graydon to talk about some of the survey highlights now.
Thanks, Liam. So we were keen to get a sense of the types of enterprises, how they are financed, and jobs and that kind of stuff. So over 50% of the respondents were from non-profit enterprises. 38% charged a collection or drop-off fees. There were 47 full-time folks employed and 47 part-time folks employed across those respondents. And there were also 125 volunteers involved, which equated to roughly 234 hours per week. In terms of land relationships and activities, we were keen to get a sense of how the enterprises were, what type of land, what type of arrangements, tenure, that kind of thing. So nearly half were on council managed or owned land, and the rest were on kind of privately owned or Crown owned or Māori owned land. And probably a key thing that came through was just the diversity of types of other activities they were doing in relation to composting. So lots of them were doing education programs, event waste management stuff, or they were growing food, or they had associated kind of social programs running alongside their composting. In terms of where the organic inputs were coming from, the most common sources were households, the hospitality sector, workplaces, landscapers, and schools. We asked about vehicle usage for collection and distribution. Seven enterprises used trucks, and the largest fleet had 8 trucks. There were 4 non-EV cars used, 2 EVs and 3 bikes. In terms of processing and markets, so 50% of the enterprises were located on one site, 22% were located on 2 sites, and 28% had 3 or more sites that they were working across. The most common technologies enterprises were using were boxes, vermicomposting, and windrows. We also asked about demand for compost products, and the majority of respondents said that demand was kind of meeting their expectations or exceeding their expectations, and a number of them said that they couldn't meet the demand, so they only anticipated this growing over time. So yeah, a pretty clear signal that there's a strong market for their product. Thanks, Liam.
Cool. And some of the challenges that were identified in the survey were kind of 3 highlights there really is, one is access to land. Many participants were quite concerned about their ability to continue doing what they were doing at their current sites. Things around, regulations, resource consents, rules and policies were also quite a barrier for a lot of enterprises, particularly those that had multiple sites. Resource consents was a real particular issue. And just accessing land, and then some issues around data collection, and there being a lack of how this should be done to really get a sense of collective impact. In terms of support that was identified from the survey that participants saw was needed, it fell into 2 main categories. The one was a real strong sense of a need for a national composting network that could advocate for composters' interests, that could share resources, knowledge, and best practice, and provide guidance on accessing council procurement and navigating resource consents and stuff like that. And just to update on that point, there has been real movement in that space with the formation of the Aotearoa Composters Network, which many of you may also be part of, which is really exciting, and there's some real momentum around that. Monthly meetings, a real kind of active Slack channel with lots of sharing of information and stuff. So that's real cool to see. So check that out if you're not involved, or yeah, watch the space. Also, in terms of support needed, the need for sustainable funding models was really highlighted as well. And in particular, seeking contract funding through procurement was seen as the way to go forward, rather than short-term or one-off grants, which don't really create much security. And the challenge that many participants felt regarding accessing council procurement was summed up really well by this quote from one enterprise, who said, "Localized composting services will never be the cheapest to councils because the additional positive outcomes, including those beyond the waste lens, are not priced in, so the true value is greater, and neither are the externalities of commercial operations, so the true cost is greater." So what did we learn from the survey? What are the take-home messages? First, that there is a real diversity in models for organics collection and processing. There's big and small models, some with one site, some with multiple sites. There are different vehicles, different technologies and collection methodologies, a variety of ways of funding and staffing operations, and also a wide range of impacts and motivations that go beyond diverting organics from landfill. But another really important take home was that we just don't really have any decent tools to compare and evaluate these diverse practices in terms of a wide range of costs, impacts, and outcomes that all have implications for how councils make investment in procurement decisions, and central government for that matter. And at an even more basic level, it was clear that a big reason we don't have good assessment tools is because of problems with how we define and categorize different models. We investigated some international case studies and terminology and concluded that this kind of diversity of lots of ways of doing organics diversion just frequently get lumped into really simplistic terms. And those terms come with a whole bunch of assumptions, things like you have on the one hand, community activities, which are called community composting or decentralized composting, and they're often assumed to be only small scale, voluntary, and therefore not commercially viable, and therefore not scalable and not procurable. And on the other hand, you have commercial or industrial, or also known as centralized facilities, which are always large scale, always the most efficient and best bang for buck at diverting organics. But the survey and the research that we did showed us there is a huge middle ground in between this kind of these common assumptions and this dichotomy that's not really fairly or accurately represented. So one of the key aims of this report was to help try to develop some language that moves beyond this dichotomy and reframe how we think about composting and organics processing activities. So we, in response to this, developed this taxonomy, a two-part taxonomy. So the first part was to distinguish all models as either composting clubs or composting service providers. So they either fall into one or the other of those categories. And then we split composting service providers into their 4 different types based on their logistical arrangements, particularly how many sites they have, and also the geographic area that they serve. For us, these were the most basic factors that differentiate the different models from one another, and also the most relevant factors to help identify different costs, impacts, and outcomes of each model. Again, we've chosen to use the word composting here, but this is less about composting as a technology. And there's lots of debate about the pros and cons of different organics processing technologies, but this is more about business models. So at this level, other technologies like anaerobic digestion, insect farming, using enzymes to process organics, whatever else, they're all relevant. There will be other, factors to consider, but they all still are broadly applicable to this taxonomy. Okay, so to discuss this taxonomy in more detail, the first part, distinguishing composting clubs and service providers. There's a bunch of detail. This is taken from the report itself, but the main way we've distinguished them is on the left. Composting clubs are projects we've identified as being primarily run by volunteers, or those that exist as an internally funded on-site solution. So there might be hospitals or schools or businesses who manage their own waste on-site. On the other hand, on the other side, we have composting service providers who are defined by whether they charge a fee to deliver a regular service, they have paid staff, and mostly process materials that are generated off-site. So composting service providers are the more obvious candidates for procurement from councils because of their commercial nature, because they serve the wider public, and also their ability to scale. But as you can see from the examples of composting service providers, there's quite a lot of diversity here. So that's why we developed the second part of the taxonomy, which is represented in this table here. So we've split them into 4 models. And on the side, it's divided by whether an enterprise has a single site or multiple sites across a distributed network. And at the top, it's split by whether they serve a small or large geographic area. So these 4 models help to encapsulate a wider range of operators that can be procured to process organics at scale. At the moment, investment in procurement is favouring the top right quadrant there, the sort of single site, large geographic area serviced. But there are, as we try to point out, a much wider range of practicable options. And they all have different implications and, for decision making. So I'm going to dig into each of these models in a bit more detail, starting with the top left, the single site, small geographic area model. Our example here is Extreme Zero Waste in Raglan. They have a horizontal composting unit up at their resource recovery centre, and that serves just the township of Raglan. So the benefits of a model like this, many of them are related to the fact that it's a very local system. The materials that they collect and also what they produce, the compost they produce, stays relatively local, which helps support local jobs. It helps to really foster community engagement and connection. It helps to reduce transport costs and the associated greenhouse gas emissions with transporting, food scraps, which are quite heavy. Also helps to boost the resilience of the system. Things don't have to travel so far, particularly with all this rain and storms we've been having, disrupting the roading network. That's really important. And there are also other things around, the smaller amount of material that's coming through one site can make it easier to manage contamination. But also having a single site can make it easier to process a wider range of inputs and things like that. Some of the downsides of this model, though, are the resilience of just relying on one site is reduced. So if something goes wrong to that site or access to that site, it's cut off, then there's no other option. And it can be harder to procure this type of model at the moment, but particularly if multiple providers might be provided and might be needed in one area. Okay, so that's that model. The next model is shifting one down on our quadrant. So this is a distributed network model serving a small geography. The example we have is Kaicycle in Wellington, who have multiple sites with a couple of different methods of composting, but serving quite a dense area in central Wellington. The benefits of this model, again, related to keeping things local, supporting local jobs, community engagement and connection, reducing transport costs and greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the lowest of all the models. The resilience of the system is very high, both because stuff isn't traveling very far, but also having multiple sites helps to boost, if something goes wrong with one site, the other sites can take up the slack, and other similar benefits to the previous model. But this model in particular can be easier to integrate with high density sort of sources of organics, so multi-unit dwellings, apartments and stuff like that, and also food production in urban areas, urban farms, community gardens and things like that can quite easily be integrated. But some of the downsides of this model, typically smaller range of organic inputs can be processed, does depend on the technology, can be much harder to procure this model under the current approaches. It's sort of having multiple sites can be seen as much more complex than just having a bigger single site. And for similar reasons can be harder to obtain resource consents and things like that than just having one site. And it can be slower to scale without that access, that secure access to where the processing gets done. All right, the third model, shifting up to the top right of our quadrant, is the one that most people are familiar with, the single site model serving a large geography. And there's a few examples around New Zealand, but the one we went with was the Enviro Waste Composting Facility in Hampton Downs. So that's up there north of Hamilton. And it's one very large site that takes materials from New Plymouth, Hamilton, Tauranga and Western Bay of Plenty, so serving a very large geographic area. The benefits of a model like this can create a wide range of regional jobs in multiple areas, much more likely to achieve economies of scale and processing capacity with this model, and able to process a wide range of organic materials, easy to procure under the sort of current system, and easier to get things like resource consents, although it does depend on the location and the size and things like that. But some of the downsides of this model, much more likely to experience community opposition, depending on where the site is proposed to be. It's much less likely to foster community engagement and connection. It can kind of perpetuate the out of sight, out of mind sort of mentality around waste. The resilience of a system like this is really reduced because it's just one site relying on, serving a very wide area. So lots of chance for things to go wrong, access to the site to be lost, or roading networks and things like that. It also, for similar reasons, has the highest transport costs and greenhouse gas emissions of moving material around, and also the large amount of material coming through one site can make it extremely difficult to manage contamination. And our final model, the bottom right of the quadrant, is the distributed network serving a large geography. So Mainoki is our example here. So they have worm farms. They have 3 at the moment across the central North Island, and they collect material from a reasonably wide area, which that material is sort of distributed across the network in various ways. So benefits of a model like this, both regional and local jobs produced. They can achieve more easy to achieve economies of scale and processing capacity, can process a wider range of materials. Again, system resilience, having multiple sites can really help with that. And again, easier to locate with food production, like the other distributed network model, where some of these worm farms are located on farms, and that's something that can be more easily achieved with this model. There's a couple of sort of question mark points around this model, where it may be a positive, but it may also be a negative. This really depends on. So this is around the ability to expand geographically can still be done in a way that minimizes the transport of how far things have to travel, and can also be able to manage contamination and sort of spread the amount that's coming through each site. But these depend on the number of sites, the location of those sites, and the scale of each individual site relative to where the material is coming from. So a bit of a question mark there. And the downsides of this model, it can be harder to obtain things like resource consents, having multiple sites, and harder to procure. It can be seen as more complex. All right, so that's kind of the detail of our taxonomy. Interested in your thoughts around that. Where you might see yourself if you're a composter. Where do you see yourself within that taxonomy? Does it make sense to you? But we'll just finish with some thoughts around investment and procurement, because many of these types of service providers are flying under the radar at the moment, but we're making in New Zealand, we're making decisions about investment and procurement that will shape what organics diversion infrastructure looks like for decades to come. So our report and our taxonomy is really trying to just provide a starting point for decision makers to understand, identify, and weigh up multiple options. And if we don't get better at doing this, then we may miss out on the positive impacts that are associated with the models that are neglected. And that can make our systems more vulnerable to risks and uncertainty in the future. So what we suggest that decision makers do is they use the taxonomy to assess which models are being supported and invested in, and then seek to address imbalances that they might have, and that there's our table again. And it shouldn't necessarily be a pick and choose approach, you know, of only one of the 4 models. You know, there could be an integrated system in one area that, you know, may still have a single site, but it would be bolstered by a more resilient and diverse system of operators to help deliver as many positive impacts as possible. Of course, a big sort of sticking point might be things around making more complex network arrangements manageable in terms of contracting and accountability, which seems to be quite a big concern for councils. But we hope our taxonomy can enable local government, but also central government, to develop, you know, more comprehensive business cases and more guidance for investment and more a diversity of systems. And there are plenty of international examples we can look to who are, you know, already have these kind of sophisticated networks of multiple sites at various scales. And one I always like to talk about is the system in Austria. They have hundreds of sites at a wide variety of scales, but the sort of the average scale is under 3,000 tons, so they're not huge, and they're sort of well connected in a network that serves urban areas as well as rural areas. So a really interesting model they have. And also it's worth looking at the system in New York, where they have both a curbside collection that takes material to larger facilities outside the city, as well as a network of drop-off sites throughout the city, and numerous composting facilities within the city, smaller scale, that have that much more kind of accessible element to them, and support soil regeneration and food growing and things like that. So really all of this is trying to emphasize the importance that new infrastructure to be, you know, fit for purpose, to be resilient, to be climate ready, diverse, and to try to harness all of those co-benefits of different models, from restoring soil health, food resilience, community cohesion, and emissions reduction. And, you know, those aren't really nice to haves anymore, but really essential things we need to face challenges in the future. So yeah, anyway, that's our presentation. You can find the report on both the Zero Waste Network website and also the Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities website, if you want to have a look at that. And yeah, also feel free to get in touch with myself or Graydon if you have any further questions about the report. But for now, we'll leave it there, and really interested in your feedback and questions.
Silence.
I was just going to go, Sarah. Hi. I just wanted to know, the survey that you circulated, was it with the purpose to build this report, or did it serve other purposes?
Shall I have a go, Liam? So it was, I think we always intended to have some kind of output like this report. Initially, the survey was just to try and get a sense of what was happening across New Zealand, because MFE in particular had identified there was a lack of data or understanding about the existing diversity of practices and enterprises. Yeah, so I mean, I think, Liam, I don't want to speak for you and Hannah, but me and colleagues who'd been doing other work over the last few years had kind of a sense that procurement was favouring one certain type of enterprise, and we had some concerns about that. So I think, yeah, I don't know, Liam, Hannah, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think it's what you said, Graydon. Like, the idea was to get some information, like basic data, from which decision makers could understand what's out there, but also start to weigh up different models better. Because one piece of feedback that was also coming through was, you know, it's all very well to talk about co-benefits, but if you can't explain those co-benefits in a way that we can actually understand and input into procurement and investment decisions, it's hard for, you know, public money to be spent on that. So the idea was to try and get some good data that could help sort of start to put some numbers around the co-benefits. But what ended up happening was we found that we were almost jumping one step beyond. You know, we couldn't actually start to talk about costs and co-benefits without having this language about who we're talking. You know, we were stuck in that, like as Liam was explaining in the presentation, it was like community versus industrial. And so yeah, this report, I suppose, ended up becoming more focused on just getting that terminology right, and then we could make some preliminary comments about pros and cons, as Liam discussed in the, you know, with the different models. But from there, now we have this stronger footing of the definitions. There is the possibility to do more research for anyone to take this taxonomy, including councils and central government, to take this taxonomy and start to make an effort to weigh up those costs and benefits in a more concrete and comprehensible way. So I hope that makes sense. Sometimes when you go out to do research, you have an idea about what you're going to find, but you actually find there's another gap that needs filling first.
Jonathan's got a hand up, but I think someone else was going to ask a question before Sarah. Was there?
Stephanie.
Stephanie?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I was just going to quickly ask if you had a link to that Austria and New York models, but then it's probably in the report anyway, I'm presuming, so I can have a look there. But if you've got it handy, if you put it in the chat, that'd be cool.
There's definitely some quite a few resources around the Austria model in the report. Trouble with that one is it's like there's bits and pieces everywhere and not like one nice kind of summary of it all. So, but yeah, so check out the report. But just for the New York one, just look up the New York Department of Sanitation website. They've got a cool map of like where all the different sites are and stuff. And yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Jonathan.
Kia ora, guys. Thank you very much for the presentation. My sort of interest is how you see the home composting group as a collective across New Zealand fitting into your rubric, your taxonomy. They can be collectively quite a significant diverter of organic waste, and significantly they pay to do that rather than be paid to do that. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts around that? My second question is, I really support the idea of getting a better taxonomy for describing what's going on in the sector. And my interest, I guess, or my question is, what do you see the next steps in terms of actually quantifying those benefits? So we've kind of got a set of words to sort of, or taxonomy to distinguish what's going on better. Do you think there's an opportunity to actually quantify those so you can actually stake a claim and empirically argue for a better balance in terms of what's procurement and the balance of things? Thanks,
Jonathan. Liam, do you want to?
Yeah,
any additional thoughts?
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Just on the first question around home composting, like we were sort of looking at enterprises or organizations, and there may be some out there who are focused on supporting home composting, who might fit actually anywhere in the taxonomy, and in terms of supporting home composting, that would be a distributed network, probably serving a small geographic area, but it's probably fits more into the kind of the composting clubs part of it, where we didn't really go into much detail, but it's sort of it is a voluntary, it's an unpaid, people doing it as a service to the community in a way, but that's not to say, we focused on what can be procured. And there's certainly, potentially, and there are examples internationally of, organizations that could be procured to support more home composting to happen. But it's potentially something that requires a different level of support rather than procurement. So more, more targeted funding, subsidies of equipment, and incentives for residents to do that. So we didn't go into that sort of detail around different types of support that would be needed for that level. But I think it's certainly, I think there's certainly real good space to be part of that more diverse integrated network.
Could I just add in there two things on that? First is that as Liam said, we made it clear that we're not saying that that composting clubs shouldn't be funded or supported, but just it's more that composting service providers need a different form of investment and procurement to composting clubs. So because what we find is that many composting service providers who don't fit into sort of this one idea of what that would look like, these large scale providers, a lot of them are being funded in a similar way to a compost club with one-off grants and things like that, which don't enable them to grow and have security as a business model dealing with external people's organic materials. So I think that was the main thing. I can't remember what the second thing was, but probably wasn't important. Sorry.
So the second part of the question was just around quantifying some of the benefits. I think this research is helpful because we've kind of identified some of the top associated benefits in addition to diversion from landfills. So I think it provides us with a starting point to then think about what would quantifying some of that look like, and to be a range of different ways you could do that, social return on investment type approaches, that kind of thing. I suppose the issue then becomes what kind of proxies you use and how that fits in with a linear, there'd be a bunch more work that would be needed to kind of explore some of that. Sorry, Hannah, you just clarifying. Oh yeah, not the second part of Jonathan's question. Cool. Liam, did you want to add anything to that?
Just quickly on the sort of what could we do next in quantifying. I think there's some real concrete stuff potentially around the economic costs and also the greenhouse gas emissions implications of different models that we could actually get some numbers around. And we have actually been talking with some people around starting to do that and figure out a way of doing that, because I think councils, particularly when they're looking at procurement, might really be interested in knowing what those are. But again, as Graydon said, there's a much wider range of those impacts and stuff that we might want to somehow quantify, but it's trickier when you're comparing. You're often those procurement decisions are not really factoring in a lot of those other things, and how do you really fairly assess those? How do you measure in a way that, especially with the diversity of approaches, that there's a lot of variation in the outcomes that they have, can become very tricky, and but potentially that there's some things where you might just have to not measure and just pick the ones we can.
Hannah's remembered what she wanted to say. So we'll go Hannah and then we'll go to Fagan, because Fagan, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, sorry. The second part of what I wanted to say was that in some ways, the support for home composting is a co-benefit of some of these other models of composting service providers. So when we were talking about community engagement, a lot of these composting service providers who have those extra bits, such as going out and doing composting workshops, inviting people to their sites, allowing volunteers, would actually be a co-benefit of some of the service providers as well. So home composting does sort of fit in when you're thinking about what model you want to procure. Okay, that's it, done.
Good point, Hannah. Thank you. Fagan. Hopefully I said your name right. Oh, I think you're muted.
We can't hear you, Fagan, for some reason. No sound.
You could put your question in the chat.
Yeah, feel free to type it out and we'll, here we go.
Any other questions or comments from folks? One thing we were interested in hearing from people on the call is what they're noticing, what you're noticing in your regions or towns or cities in terms of where procurement is going.
Hello, yes, Ailey speaking here from Christchurch City Council. We're in the middle of a procurement process for our OPP, so obviously I can't comment on that. But I'm just interested in talking about the challenges that you mentioned about community opposition to sites. So do you have any recommendations for engaging communities and elected members in discussing the differences between the challenges with large-scale single-site operations and the odours and things that come from that versus the smaller scale operations? And do you know if MFE intend to use your information to back up and support local government staff in discussing the pros and cons of these different models with our communities and elected members?
Good question. Good questions there. I'm not aware that MFE, we haven't really touched base with MFE since the release of the report, but I plan to do so in the next wee while. So I can't comment on that at this point. Liam or Hannah, do you have anything more in terms of engagement with MFE on this?
No, but yeah, that's a good point that we probably should remind them that it's been released. It would have been sent out and when we did an original send out, but a more direct invite email would be good. But I guess one thing, Ailey, could be actually if local government were to ask MFE to provide such information and point them to the research as well, that would help. And in terms of getting community engagement when there is opposition, I think potentially thinking about what has created the opposition in the first place and what could be mitigating factors. And if it's decided that a more distributed approach where you've got smaller amounts of material going to different places is where you want to go, those are also models where community can have more kind of engagement with sites. So that could be, one way of even just talking about the different options with officials and the public is an opportunity to build community support for different approaches.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point that we should approach them directly and ask them to promote some of this work that you guys have done. Thank you.
And I'll just add, there were a few MFE staff at Wastemans when I delivered a version of this presentation, including Harry Livesey, who's working on the curbside collections side of things, which is somewhat relevant, but I think and it is good to hear them that MFE sort of starting to change their language around what they're recommending and things a little bit. But yeah, Harry's probably one to follow up with. And I think too the action and investment plans that are sort of being consulted on at the moment are possibly, in my mind, are kind of a good opportunity for MFE to start to develop some more guidance around this stuff. For councils and for how the infrastructure is going to look. So potentially if you have a chance to input into that, could be worth raising some of this stuff.
Thank you. That will be a good piece of work for the TAO forum to look into.
So we've just had a question from, jumping back to Fagan's question, just wondering if has been much kōrero around industrial commercial scale composting that could be an option for breaking down organics from flood debris. It didn't come up, as far as I'm aware, it didn't come up in the survey. Liam or Hannah, are you aware of any discussion on that?
No, I'm not. Don't really have anything to add on that, except that I think that the anaerobic digester in Reparoa was offering, or maybe did, take some food waste that from Hawke's Bay after the cyclone, but that's just food waste. It doesn't necessarily deal with a wider range of organics.
There's probably been a bunch of stuff happened since we did this work at the end of last year, so there might have been movement in that space, Fagan, that we're not aware of. Tim, you've got your hand up.
Kia ora. It's in some sense a half response to the previous question, one before Fagan. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but I need to say that I'm aware of and working on one particular MFE, WMF funding application which will quote this particular study, and another one which has to some degree at least used the taxonomy that's in this in my mind, and will likely, as the expression of interest, or if and when the expression of interest continues onto the further phases, to quote this piece. So in that sense, it's not only that we would like to see MFEs applying this, but also we as composters and people who are interested in establishing these different scales of hubs can be quoting it back to them, I think. So yeah, massive gratitude to you guys to providing that piece of important funding application infrastructure, as it were.
Thanks, Tim. That's great to hear. We just had another question from Waikariri, wondering if there has been much engagement with tangata whenua in this space. Liam and Hannah, any initial thoughts on that question?
One thing yeah, kia ora Waikariri, thanks for the question. We did have some responses on the survey from some kura kaupapa and marae who are doing composting, I think. Is that right, Graydon?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, like many things, the survey is not, it's hard to really represent, you know, like a wider sense of a community, and that was a very generic sort of survey, so hard to really get any kind of meaningful engagement out of that. But yeah, certainly a gap that would be good to explore further in terms of, you know, what the aspirations and what's already happening and that tangata whenua are doing in the space, for sure.
We just had another comment from Sharon saying that community compost face the funding and site security limitations that the report highlights. So thanks for sharing that, Sharon. The other question we just...
Sharon, yeah, yeah, so that was just in response to, you asked about different regions, what was happening in different regions. So it's a two-part thing. I pressed send prematurely, actually. I was just kind of filling you in on, you know, Nelson.
Right, yeah.
But community compost is, you know, another model that you're probably aware of already, but just thought I'd put it out there for other people who might not be so aware.
Great, thanks, Sharon.
Can I just add something else to Waikariri's question around engagement with tangata whenua? There is which Waikariri you're aware of, but a waste minimisation fund application that a project which is a collaboration between Zero Waste Network, Parakore, Te Waka Kaiora, and the Aotearoa Composters Network, really trying to get some money into a collective national approach around this. And a really important aspect of that will be to develop, you know, kind of a tiriti-based approach, you know, a co-governance approach to this space. And it's very much early days, and there's a lot more relationship building I think needs to happen in this space. But it's, you know, it's really, really important. And you know, there is MFE do want to support tangata whenua to do more in this space, and yeah, it would be great if you know, we can actually help to divert some of that large amount of money that is coming into the space into supporting tangata whenua to achieve their aspirations in this space. But yeah, lots of work to, I think, to continue that work.
Thanks, Liam. We just had one other comment from Bridget. I may have missed this. Is there any consistency in kura to follow zero waste practices, composting, marakai, etc., and ensuring waste is dealt with well? I'm interpreting that question around kind of tikanga, around materials and that, inputs and that kind of stuff. It's not something we really got into in the survey, so I don't feel confident responding to that based on what we've done. Liam or Hannah, any other thoughts? I may have misinterpreted your question though, Bridget, so.
Thank you. I'm just, because so many schools are doing different things and some don't do anything with their waste. And just wondering if there's any sort of consistency or going to be, or if you know of any consistency coming through for our kura, because it doesn't seem like anyone is leading the way there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think generally like what our survey found was there is a lot of diversity, as Liam mentioned, across both composting service providers and the compost clubs, and that kura schools generally would fall into the composting clubs model, which I think for a variety of reasons wouldn't necessarily want to kind of be very prescriptive about how composting clubs should run, and because we shifted our focus towards the composting service providers, I guess there's still more work that could be done within the composting club space around, guidance. And this fits into Jonathan's question around home composting as well, guidance, the extent to which, composting service providers could be providing, part of their business could be offering engagement with kura, supporting workshops to get consistency, and also, minimizing contamination and compost and all that kind of stuff. So again, it is actually something that could be built into the procurement of organic materials management going forward, that providers should be providing these extra social outcomes. That's certainly something that could be considered if that fit into the procurement model.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm just mindful of the time, and we've got one other question. Can we share the content of the questions in the survey? Yep, that should be all good. I will follow up. Maybe we can get that appended to the report on the Zero Waste Network website, so you guys can all see what the questions were. They took quite a bit of work to get them, given no one had done anything like this before. So yes, I think we're almost at 1 o'clock. Daughter, do we hand back to you now, or?
Yes, happy to take over here. So yeah, thank you guys. Thanks everybody for your questions and your comments. And I know that the report is probably going to be useful in lots of contexts for a while. So that's really, really exciting. Thanks to our speakers as well for being so knowledgeable and so awesome and getting the research done. So I will just close with a karakia to end. Karakia tēnei. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia mama. Tēnā kau te tinana me te wairua e te ara tangata. Hoia rā e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga. Tūturu whakamaua ki a tīna. Humie huie, tai kia. Thanks everybody. I'll press end and you'll all disappear. See you later.
Thank you.
Cheers.